So I've got to admit, I'm actually pretty excited to get this talk. Matter of fact, I think it's fair to say that I'm inspired, which is surprising because I don't think there's ever been a time in my life where I would have predicted that I'd be excited to be talking about business in any way, shape, or form. But that's what's happening. And the inspiration came from a Fair Play Alliance symposium in London back in October of 2019. We had a roundtable discussion that went over a bunch of topics. But towards the end of the discussion, we really went pretty deep on one question, which is how do we get companies to invest in fair play? And while it was a very compelling discussion, there was something about it that just bugged me. It just kind of stuck with me for a while, and I really couldn't put my finger on it. So I spent some time thinking about it, and here's what my thought process went like. I began to think, well, we're talking about fair play, and I believe we need to focus on player dynamics for fair play. So that means what we're really talking about is, for lack of a better word, selling player dynamics. Why does that sound so familiar? And then it hit me. Is player dynamics the new UX design? Because I've heard these exact same questions asked many times before. Because I've been a UX designer for many years, and especially in the earlier days, we were asking the same questions. And I heard many of the same questions and discussions about these challenges at conferences and also at Riot Games, where I worked for quite a while. So follow me on a journey a little bit. I started at Riot Games in 2011. And at the time, it was a much smaller company. The UX team was pretty humble. I believe I was the third UX hire. We had a total of 5 UX designers. And we were trying to get a seat at the table. And a seat at the table in UX design is probably the same as for many other disciplines, but what we were concerned about is not just being embedded on a team, but helping drive vision and strategy and helping the company work towards the future in a more comprehensive way. And we learned a lot of lessons in order to make this happen, maybe to earn our seat, if you will. Now, if we fast forward 6, 7 years or so into the end of 2018, a lot has changed, including the length of my hair, as you can see, and the logo of the company, now that I think about it. But at this point, the UX team is much bigger and has much greater presence, not just across the company, but at different levels of the organization. And we're once again seeing a discipline that's maturing, that's trying to get that seat at the table, but is also trying to find its way within the organization. And this one is called player dynamics. And of course, we move forward into today. But player dynamics has had a presence at Riot for quite a while, though we didn't have the term at the time. See, not long after I joined Riot, I joined the player behavior team, which was doing player dynamics work, right? But once again, we didn't think of it that way. We just were using what we had at the time. And it's taken quite a while for us to mature this field, not just at Riot, but in other places. And it took quite a while for us to even get a name. But this isn't unexpected because this is what happens in many fields. So let's see what's gone on with UX design over the years. Some people, when we look back to what caused or helped UX design as a discipline come about, go really far back, further back than I'm showing here on this timeline. Some have said feng shui was where it started. I don't know about that. I mean, that seems pretty over-romanticized to me. But we can look back to particular books from the 1950s and particular companies' work in the 1980s, and we can look at products. But it really isn't until the mid-90s that anyone was using the term user experience, and that was coined by Don Norman at Apple. He actually coined it in a book of his that came out at the late 80s, but he got the title at Apple in the mid-90s, and by the early 2000s, people are really starting to use it. We see books with the term user experience in it, and then eventually we have a product that many people point to and say, like that, right? That's a great example of what user experience design is all about. This is over the course of decades. Player dynamics, though it might seem new, it's actually been evolving in a very similar way. I'm not going to go back to all the creation of games and how they evolved. We're really looking at the time period where we had computer networks and people were playing at a distance. And so we can go back to the late 60s, early 70s and see where this was starting to shape up. People were figuring out what this meant. Then we can go to the 1980s with games like Habitat, which if you don't know about it, that came from LucasArts. And it actually was the world's first virtual community. And it's a fascinating read if you find the paper that was written on it from a behavioral perspective, and just for the fact that there were tens of thousands of people who were playing in this world who were also paying by the minute. It's pretty amazing. Now we fast forward to Ultima Online, and we're starting to see a lot of terms that we know today regarding behavior and some solutions. They learned a lot of lessons that unfortunately we're still learning. I'm selfishly integrating myself into this timeline because I can. And in pointing to League of Legends and the player behavior team, I'd like to think that we've done some pretty good work in this space. So forgive me for the shameless self-promotion. But even further and even closer to today, we see the industry starting to get organized, starting to figure out how can we collectively focus on fair play. And this in particular is the Fair Play Alliance. And about that time, we see that the player dynamics term has been coined. Now, there's a lot in common, and are some pretty big gaps from when we see milestones to when we actually even have enough organization or understanding of a space to give it a name. And there are a lot of lessons that user experience designers have learned that we can leverage. So maybe it doesn't take us so long to get the seats at the table, right, to actually help people invest in this space. But we do have to keep in mind that these are the early days for player dynamics. And there's a lot that we still don't know that we really don't know. But by leveraging these lessons, I think it'll be much easier for all of us to help, for lack of a better word, sell player dynamics. And what I would like to do for the remainder of the talk is walk you through some of these lessons that we've seen in UX design and that we've been using at Riot in player dynamics to help the company grow and to help grow our own understanding and to affect the kind of change that we feel that we need to see within our company and the industry. And there are 5 strategies that we're going to dive into. The first is champion by doing. Now, some may prefer the term evangelize by doing. It's up to you which term makes the most sense. I like how champion by doing rolls off the tongue. And we're going to go through a few ways that I've seen this to really be effective. Like this is what we used with UX and what we've used with player dynamics. So the first is you've got to find a way to do the work. It's just that simple, right? You may not always get approval. You may not always get buy-in, and that's fine. Find a way to do the work. And the best place to start is by seeking achievable problems, right? Look for quick wins. It's totally fine. What you're trying to do at this stage is build confidence and build momentum. And the people you're going to be building confidence with are partners. You're going to want to find partners, and you're going to need to be a good partner because everyone that you work with has something that they're accountable for. And though you're trying to affect a change, it means other people may have to change. And you need to be patient, recognize what they're accountable for, and work together to achieve those goals, figure out how you can help each other. And be careful as you go not to do a few particular things. Don't push philosophy. It's not going to work. It's just going to sound rude, or people's eyes will glaze over. I've learned this the hard way, and I get excited about the philosophical part. So trust me, don't push too hard on it, though it might be helpful. Don't insult people with education. Slapping them upside the head with research to try and prove how they just are ignorant in some way. It's not going to help. You want to put this knowledge to use. Just don't beat people up with it. And with that in mind, don't focus on wrongs. If you're going to be a good partner, if you're going to help, right, don't focus on where people may have arguably screwed up. What you want to do is solve the problem, not the blame. So be patient and try not to get too worked up when things aren't quite going the way you want, because what you're doing is trying to affect change. Change can be slow and sometimes painful. So with that in mind, you will find yourself in a position where you're going to want to fine-tune your strategy, maybe find specific tactics that will work for your company. And the question you need to start with is, how mature is it? How mature is my company in the player dynamics space? And there are different levels. And what I would like to introduce now is something that we've been using at Riot Games that's been very helpful for us to understand where we're at and where we may need to go. So this is the player dynamics maturity model. There are 6 levels, 1 to 6. Arguably, the first could be 0. I'd be fine with that if you want to revise it. But what we're looking at is a way for us to evaluate where we're at. And there are signs that you can see in these companies that align to particular tactics that I've seen to be effective. So the first level is skeptical. That one's pretty easy to tell. If your company's not doing anything and just doesn't think that this is a thing, then you're probably in a space that's fairly skeptical. Ceremonial is where a company agrees that this is important, but isn't really investing anything in it. They don't see that they should, or it could be that you're at a company that has a franchise where there are pretty fixed expectations for what the next game is going to be, and change could be a scary proposition. Provincial is where Riot has been for the longest time, where we had a single team on a single game. That was originally the player behavior team. And this basically puts the burden on one team to be thinking about all of your player dynamics concerns. Essential is a level that happens when your company begins to shift its perspective from reactive to proactive and begins to look at player dynamics as something that every game team needs to be concerned about. So now we're seeing multiple teams across the company. Cultural is where very few game companies are, where they have committed themselves wholeheartedly to it. Maybe they were founded on focusing on the space. And societal is where a company has moved outward, where now they're at a point where they're starting to create external programs, maybe in schools, high schools, college, et cetera, where they want to teach some things to the community that they found viable that apply, of course, to player dynamics. Now, if you've had a moment, and hopefully I didn't go too quick for you to get a sense of where your company's at, you may want to know what are some strategies that are helpful. And here are some that I've seen work pretty good. The first, and this is for the skeptical companies, is fly under the radar. You may not get investment at first. And what you're going to want to do is go undercover. Find a way to do that work, as I described, come back with some results, right? A champion by doing, essentially. If your company is ceremonial, what I believe is most helpful is look at what the company's already doing that others in the space are doing. Like, show the likenesses. The work may be accidental. That's fine. It just may be something to build on. You may also look to other games, like games, or someone or company in the industry and say, well, here's something that they're doing that proves that, because there are results that hopefully you can point to, that that's safe for us to try. And you can build some good momentum with this approach. Provincial, your best bet there is to get really good at interventions. To make sure that everyone understands what I mean, interventions are those systems that help either proactively deal with common forms of disruption or reactively. Reactively tends to be things like penalties and reports. Proactive tends to be those things that, let's say, like name check, which prevents some inappropriateness from getting into the system. You're going to want to get really good at that, and that will take you a long way. And once you hit that threshold where it's not enough, you're going to want to develop a shared framework. So essential, again, is where there are multiple teams around the company, and you want everybody thinking the same way and working in a similar framework so that they can align, but also make independent decisions across the org. And for the last 2 levels, I don't know. I don't know any company that's actually made it to these levels yet, at least in my opinion. But I hope many of us do, and I'm happy to race everyone to the top. Now, let's say you got a good sense of the maturity level of your company, and you know how you're generally going to operate. What you really need to be thinking about now is a process, right? that you can use, some way to show how you're going to go about doing the work. And what I would like to introduce now is a framework and a process that Riot has been using with increasing success over the last year or two. And at the core of it is the ECE framework. And ECE helps us answer the question, how do we shape behavior at scale? It stands for environment, consequences, and encouragement. And another way to think of these is you need to set the right conditions, you need to provide the right feedback, ideally in a timely fashion, and help to identify and encourage the right kinds of behavior. Now, with this at the core, we need a really simple process that everybody can use. And this is the one that we have adopted. And it's just 5 steps. Hopefully it'll be pretty self-explanatory, but I'm just going to jump in so we can see a little bit of what each of these mean. And we're going to look at some examples of where we've been using these over the last so many months. The first step is to identify core values. And that's about what your game values and you as a company, because it all comes back to the values. Right? People need to understand where you're coming from and the game is coming from. This is where expectations start. And you need to learn to be consistent in your values and how you express it. So start with identifying what your values are, list them, distill them down to the simplest form possible, and then begin to think about how you're going to align everything towards them. With your values in mind, you're ready to define disruption. Now, a common question in player dynamics conversations is, how do you define disruption? Everybody has a different meaning for it. Well, not really. One easy way to get at what would be disruptive to your game is this formula. Ask yourself 3 questions. What is the intended experience? What are players expecting, right? Particularly from the genre, or if you have an existing player base? And what is disruptive to both of these? This will get you really far in understanding what would be disruptive. Also keeping in mind your own values. What have you stated to the community? Like, what are you about, right? And what you see here is the list that we use when we were putting together the definition, or the list of disruptive behaviors we believed well, let me rephrase it. These are the things that we believe would be disruptive to Valorant, which is one of Riot's newer titles. And this was pretty comprehensive, and it told us, okay, great. We know this is disruptive. Now we know also what to put into our reporting categories so that players would be able to say, yes, these are the things that we have seen, and these are the things that we believe are also disruptive. It wasn't telling us necessarily they agreed, but we knew based on many other conversations and a lot of research that this was directionally where everyone was aligned. The third step is to codify behavior expectations. And the examples that you see here are from Valorant. The left is what you see as a player within the game, and it's the top of the pile, if you will. Basically, this is about the 4 things that you're definitely agreeing to, but it was, of course, a limited space. So the full-length version is on their website. And there we list not only the expectations that we have for you in a pro-social way, but also we get into the details about what will happen if you're exhibiting undesirable behaviors. And this stage is really just about setting expectations so that we all understand what we're getting into. But if you're going to help affect change, you're going to need to get targeted. You're going to need to target specific behaviors, and that's the 4th step. And at this point, you're starting to bring a lot of your thinking together. You're using the ECE framework because you want features that align to each of those. You're going to look at the desirable behaviors and the undesirable behaviors. And my recommendation is just using a big table to do both of these. And you use the behavioral expectations you've set, like in the community code that we saw from Valorant. This is actually a version of what we did where we mapped out, here are the categories of disruptive behaviors. These are the specific things that we've seen. And here are all the things that we believe we should build that will target those behaviors. And we can use this to create an understanding of priority. So we want to map, prioritize, and then develop these features. And naturally, we're going to want to measure them. And that's step 5. We need to measure and we need to adapt, because we won't know going out the gate how something is going to, or how successful, I should say, a feature is going to be for a particular audience. Now, these are some metrics that you may want to start with, but we're going to now get into the 4th strategy, where we can have a framework that should help us get a better understanding of how we need to measure. And the strategy is to arm yourself with data, because you need to know. You need to know whether you're doing any good. And you need to know how you're going to measure success and identify those areas where you may need more work. So I'd like to introduce another framework that we've been using at Riot that we call GAMES. Good time, attitude, mastery, engagement, and social health. These are the dimensions that we believe we need to look at as far as player dynamics in order to look at things holistically, to make good decisions as companies and as product owners. Now, engagement is probably the most familiar. You want to know whether you're losing players, you're keeping players, all the usual things. But good times helps us get a sense of, are they really enjoying themselves? What's the quality of the experience? Attitude is about trying, right? And are they making an effort, especially when it comes to changing the behavior that we've communicated to them they may need to correct a little bit on? Mastery, are they getting better at the game? Are they growing? Are they learning more about it, which can make it easier when they're playing with others? And social health is the community. It's all at a community level. Now, if you want to use this, you can use a template. The template does not come with stock metrics. The point of this approach is for you to make sure you're not forgetting the dimensions that you need to be considering, and to choose goals for that particular feature that aligns to that factor, that dimension, identify the signals you're going to look for, and then you can end up with your metrics. And here's an example of that in practice. This is something I put together that represents the chat restrictions feature in League of Legends. Here are some goals, some signals, and some metrics. Now, you may see similar metrics for a number of these. That's fine. And in practice, you may find sometimes that you don't have goals for a particular area where you don't think it's, you might feel it's stretching a bit to put in those, to create some goals for, let's say, mastery for reports, for instance. That's fine. That's fine. This is just to help us understand that there are multiple dimensions and that we shouldn't forget them, because there's a lot that we need to understand to affect behavior change. All right. There's one more strategy I want to show you a little bit about, and that's prepare for misconceptions. If you're a UX designer, or if you know any, then you probably have heard quite a few stories about the misconceptions in UX. I won't go through all of those now, though I'll be happy to talk with you at some point about them for fun, if you like. But we're already seeing some misconceptions in player dynamics. So let's take a look at a few, and a few ways that I've responded to them, sometimes just for fun. The first, maybe the most classic, is, well, that's just the internet. We can't help it. That's what people on the internet do. But there's a problem. We have a responsibility. We didn't make the whole internet. We're not concerned about the whole internet because no one company or team can control it. What we're concerned about is our part of the internet. So think about it this way. People in our games wouldn't be having the bad experiences that they may be having in our games if we didn't put them in our games, right, to begin with. And so that part of the world is ours. And furthermore, players are asking us to do more in this space. The next, and I think this is a pretty fair question overall, is shouldn't a game designer just be doing this work? Of course they should. I would say the same about UX design. We should all be concerned about the user experience. The thing is, you do a lot of stuff. It can be really hard to focus on everything. If you're needing to focus on a particular part of an experience, it's hard to think about the whole thing, which is why we have UX designers, so that they can keep that holistic perspective. And what we've seen through player dynamics is it grows the same way. Eventually, you're going to need to specialize so you can focus where you need to and make sure you're not losing the perspectives, right, that help bring out the most in your games. And the final, oh, and this hurts. Oh, God, it hurts. I heard this recently and decided to add it in at the last minute, but the misconception is this is all too fluffy. Oh, it burns. Because we'll talk about concepts like cohesion and how important it is, and people will come back with things like it's too fluffy. Decades of science begs to differ. We are not making this stuff up. We're just trying to figure out how best we can apply it to games. But all right, let's bring it on home. For those of us that are working in fair play and in player dynamics, we want to increase investment. And there are 5 strategies that we've been using that I've seen to be effective, that we saw effective in UX design, and hopefully will save you a lot of time and effort. Champion by doing, just get in there, find a way to do the work. Gauge the maturity level of your company, which means figure out the right strategy for where they're at to help them move up that ladder. Find a process, work it, hone it with others so that you can have a reliable way to organize towards these goals and understand what you're doing. Get that data so you know if you're affecting change. We've proposed a framework for both this and the process that we hope will help. And prepare for the misconceptions, because they're going to happen. That comes with the territory, did with UX design, and it will again for player dynamics and our work in fair play. Thank you very much.